Hi everyone, and welcome back to the series, and thanks so much for coming here on the first day after spring break. It's really much appreciated. And welcome to tonight's event, which is Modernist and Experimental Literature from Kharkiv in translation. And the translators today are Ian Ross Singleton and Eugene Ostashevsky, who will read their translations of Ukrainian modernists, which are connected to the Kharkiv city and the Kharkiv literary tradition. The authors that we will learn about and hear today in English are, first of all, Mykhail Semenko, the founder of the Ukrainian Futurism, as well as Yurii Yanovsky, who is the author of the novel Shipwright, Майстер, корабля, a novel from the 1920s about the Ukrainian film industry, in fact. As well as Maik Iohansen, a modernist poet and a fiction writer. Eugene and Ian today are also joined by Ekaterina Derysheva, who will be reading her own original poetry.
I thought it would be
translations. Okay, okay. Thanks. So let me introduce them very briefly in the reverse order, reverse to the order in which they will be speaking. Ekaterina Derysheva is a displaced poet from Kharkiv, who was born in 1994 in Melitopol. Her poems have been translated into 11 languages, if I'm not mistaken, and she's currently based at U Penn, where she has a Artist Protection Fund Fellowship until the end of this year. Is it so? Okay. Ian Ross Singleton is a writer and a translator from Russian and Ukrainian. Thank you once again, everyone, for joining us today.
People are mainly interested in Semenko of the 20s, but I'm going to talk about 1914, when he founded his first futurist group. Now I can't see you, but I might be able to see this. Okay, here is a portrait of Semenko by Anatol Petritsky. It's at Cafe Polk at Kharkiv, and in the late 20s, this was kind of the main literary cafe which stood among all the publishing houses, and this is where everyone hung out, but in particular, the members of Nova Generacja, the avant-garde, futurist, constructivist. I'm not sure whether these terms have very exact meanings in 1927 to 1930 when this magazine was being published. Okay, so, but I will read earlier stuff. In January 1914 or February 1914, wasn't like a one-day thing, Semenko in Kiev, and his brother Vasil, who is a painter, you can see him here, and another painter named Pavlo Kozhun declare themselves the first kind of group of Ukrainian futurists. They call themselves Quero futurist, from Latin quero, to seek. And they have a bunch of events. Semenko publishes several versions of a brochure of his poems, but of course it's a very kind of short-lived movement, if you can even call it a movement, of 3 people, because as soon as World War I starts, that's really over. Semenko spends most of the war in Vladivostok as a radio operator. And when he comes back, I mean, it's a different historical period. The futurist group that he builds in the 20s is very, very different, with different interests, different ideas. But you can see here from Mykhail Semenko, that he's wearing futurist face paint, right? And you can see Mykhail Semenko here in face paint in front of his own painting, a futurist painting, which is a painting of the city. And I'm going to read a couple of pieces by his brother, which go with the painting. But first, I'm going to start with a January 1914 poem, Sun-Blooded. I won't live with no sun, can't stand cold lights. I'm sun-blooded and love the sun in my blood, and the sun in the blood curdles of painters. And when there's a cloud blocking my sun, my blood doesn't cool. It burns, flames, rips. It would obey no fire nor water. It takes me, and ascending together, we meet the sun again, hollering, "Hey, you sun, regards to you from the rebellious Semenko." Near Vladimir. And that's the poem takes place or starts by the statue of Saint Vladimir in Kiev. I was sitting on a hill near Vladimir and was watching the smoke from the steamer stacks, thinking about my life, this, that, and another thing. There she walked past. Drop those thoughts of yours. I jumped. Did I make it up, I asked myself. No, it was for real. Somebody called me. I left that hill and that Vladimir, took a walk by her side, working out my jaws. Found out your name was Nina, which was a pleasant surprise. That moniker reminded me of something. Nina, Nina. It was here you said, let's go to the variety show. I was like, yes, because you're quite a number. So we went together and easy went the palaver. Shuttles were bobbing between our eyes. That dame was like something out of an astronomy textbook. Our colloquy touched upon nights and eyes because, see, we gabbed all the way to Varone, the symbolist poet. And inasmuch as I could tell by her eyes, here was a man to her taste. And then we discussed some other things, but good God, it's really time to drop it because you're so hot. I don't want to just saunter on the Chrещатик. I'm going on and on, whereas the reader really wishes to find out the ending. Okay then, here it is, the ending. So, I mean, I tried to kind of grasp a bit of like the insouciance of just the talking way of his talking. I mean, he's in his kind of early 20s, if that. Yeah, he's 22. Okay, I don't really know how to read this, to be honest. And it's translated in two different ways. There's the Kruchonek translation, which is a transliteration, because Kruchonek argued that translating poetry is barbarism, and because you just transliterate it. And then there's the Cubist method, which maybe I will read, where I try to guess what words these fragments are of, and to make these words in English and to fragment them as well. Ein, ik, noop, melt, down, p, ilti, squeak, melt, Things were melting early that year. This one I really like because it's more like a punk song than a poem. The Witch. Every day I want all new words. Every day I want all new words. Every day I want all new words. That's it. Kitchen or the cookery. I had enough of rhyme. I want to watch words move, my thoughts following them, music forming it selfishly. I overtake the motions of life. take no offense, turn a blind eye to people. They always look like they want to look. I had enough of rhyme. I want to join the stupidity of a totally other music. Want to say what no ear has heard, forms on the tongue for the first time. Let me shut up a bit again to trudge again after the words of others. Undo my mind, no. Gotta stand up and stand on one leg. Maybe then I'll grasp some secrets and stuff. So here what's interesting is that it's a program poem, right? And it's a program poem that says I'm going to be writing free verse from now on, which he doesn't really stick to at all. I mean, he writes in rhyme like 3 days later. But it's interesting so in 1909, when Italian Futurism starts, the Italians identify themselves with the free verse movement. And it goes like that until basically May 1912, when Marinetti decides that free verse is not enough because everybody writes free verse, and that the futurists need to have their own language, words in freedom, parole in libertà, and begins inventing it. First puts out a manifesto and then starts inventing it. And here we see Semenko associating with free verse, but parole in libertà becomes, in a couple of years, basically typographic visual poetry of the kind that Semenko starts doing after the war. Today is the 1st of May, May 1st, the joyous day of young spring. Crowds fill parks and squares during the day, and in the evening the gardens will open. I hear the cracks of fireworks, the sounds of brass floating in from somewhere. But I'm staying at home, not going anywhere today. Today is the 1st of May, the joyous day of young spring. Young spring. Trumpets blare, clarinets talk, crowd buzzes, craning their hats, all eyes on the pilot. I'm looking at the ladies, lips, smiles pour and play, smiles of the eye, voice, noise, laughing, streaming. The soul, a solar string instrument, opium and blood, bubbles, caresses softly, crowd, buoyant, voice, noise, to be happy like a crowd, to have no care. The aviator loops the loop in the clouds. To loop the loop is to do what they call the death spiral, right? It's to go upside down. And I've been interested for a while in the connection between futurism, or rather the new poetic language of futurism, and aviation, because in Marinetti's first manifesto of the new poetic language of futurism, of words and freedom, he connects it rhetorically to his experience 2 years before that, flying over Milan as the passenger of the Peruvian, French, Croatian aviator Juan Bilavucic. In Russia, also Kamensky, whose Tango with Cows I worked on, was the first futurist poet aviator, the first real poet aviator ever, to the best of my knowledge. The first one to have a flying license. So there's this kind of really curious connection, which is there for all of the avant-garde, even for Picasso, for Robert Delaunay, right? They all see themselves as kind of the equivalent of aviators. Picasso and Braque used to present themselves at parties like as the brothers Wright of painting. So anyway, so when I translated this poem, I really wanted, my feeling was that he was, the poems are so immediate, so I thought that he was reacting to an air show that he saw that week in Kiev. And I went around the newspapers, and in fact, I was right. So looping the loop was something, at least in the Russian Empire, invented by a guy named Nesterov, and outlawed immediately as just too dangerous. So the Imperial Aviation Club outlawed it. But another aviator, Adam Gabirvlinsky, did, as you can see, did a loop-de-loop in Kiev, literally on the day, I forget if it's the day before or the day of the writing of the poems. Where are bu cabbies, people, tram cars, people, automobiles, motor runs, motor rotor runs, a berceuse for the carousel, elms, lilies, giant roads, char, smoke, steel, garret, cigarette, blue smoke, black smoke, mitted, gas, long-lived fumes, big fumes, love, cough, live, drive, live, you, O-line, auto, tram. Poems like this I try to translate as paintings. So when they're composed of pieces of words, I basically think of them as, having the words having the same relations as pieces of words have on Cubist or Futurist paintings. So this is why it has this visual aspect and this distribution that's not kind of a normal poem distribution. Okay. Self-portrait. Hail, Kohail, my Emen, I, Messen, Mix, Koma, Mch, Kumsa, Mk, Mik, Semen, Komen, Enk, Mykhail Semenko, Mik, Mykhail Semenko, O Semenko Mykhail, or Mykhail Semenko. GK, BK, VK, NK, TK, R, Ro, O. Okay, and this is a tango. Oh, I can't make my way into that dance hall where my sweet highness hid behind a dance wall of fancy dancers making pas and passes to the mellifluous clink of glasses. The sparkling chanteuse sings out distraughtly. The orchestra accompanies her softly. The clinking clinks, the voices buzz, a backup choir. But I'm desiccated with desire of finding her. I watch the clean and lighted crowd from the garden. Laughter resounds, they all got their guard down. Neither the notes nor their lines persuade me. Yet if I stay unswayed, no Cyrano can save me. I look for hottest Plume, her tallest Plume. She must be tangoing with others in that ballroom. I'm tangled up, the situation's dire. I'm tangibly expiring with desire of finding her. Okay, a hairdresser strummed the guitar in my soul. Sometimes I thought of her and tried to compose a letter I was not going to post, practiced some phrases in rusty French, glanced twice at an image of Christ, silently hummed sentimental waltzes, looked up at the beams in their gossamer robes. No, I was just bored. I was exclusively bored. My heart was a moldy cantaloupe. City, frrr, or rather, frrr, snorted, sputtered, hissed sonorously after the motor car mudda, snow, fog, sled, swayed with a crackle, mudlets, unfirmed uniform silhouettes, soft coquettes, glancing glances, cackle, yo, you. Forty Karbavanse. After the fires, the city, its buildings, charred skeletons, waits for someone to come and comfort it. Build the white marble gates and the clear-lined church. Women of the people are digging through the ashes. A pound of potatoes costs 40 karbavanse. At night, the city is burning still, the church dome reflecting flames. In how soon, in how long a time will we have cow butter? He yanks at the back of your jacket, the malcontented one. Okay, and the last couple of pieces, I don't even know if I can read them. I guess I can just show them. When he tries to reconstitute the futurists in 22, there is a very intense claim to internationalism. And in fact, when you open the Miscellany Anthology, Almanac, whatever you want to call it, it's not just in Ukrainian, it's in a whole bunch of languages. It's in really all the major languages of the European avant-garde. Nova Generacija was doing similar stuff. But here it's very condensed because the manifestos, the articles, there's something in French, there's something, as you can see here, in English, in German, in Russian, and I think, well, it's not, I think, it's kind of something that's obvious. The point to doing this, first and foremost, is to speak to other European avant-garde groups without going through Moscow. Does that make sense? Yeah. To speak to them directly, to establish your own relations with what's going on in Berlin, with what's going on in Paris, and even what's going on in London and maybe even New York. So I did these with Ostap Kim and Daniel Mellis, with whom I work on Kamensky, did the layout. And you can see here, these are from 1922, but they're very much about, I'm not gonna read them. And they're not really meant to be read as much as they're meant to be seen, right? Because the order of reading is not certain. But it's internationalism, communism, right? Proletarians of the world unite, and very interestingly, industrialization, right? And I think the New York subway appears in this poem somewhere at the bottom. At least I think it's the New York subway, some kind of subway. And here is another one where he promises to shatter capitalism into shards by, this incredible industrial revolution in the Donbass, coal production, iron production, and tries to associate futurism as a movement, not with a kind of anarchic, young man, urban modernity stuff that futurism was associated with before the war, but with the social, the economic changes affected by, I guess, the party here. But that also is connected to, what Futurism is doing in Italy and elsewhere.
Thank you for everybody for coming here, and thank you for welcoming me into this space. I saw a lot of parallels that was the whole reason why we were talking about this on Facebook, putting this together. My approach to this comes from my interest in Odessa. I wrote my novel about Odessa and in English, and when I heard about Maistr korabля, I was fascinated by this a novel in Ukrainian, but about Odessa. So, and the reason is because, and so a lot of this is going to be to some people quite obvious, and then maybe to some others not. I'm sort of trying to build a context for this novel. So, I mean, Odessa, as many of you know, is traditionally Russophone. I didn't say this, but I've heard people say that, before 2022, if somebody was speaking Ukrainian, in Odessa, somebody would say, "Where are you from?" You can't possibly be from Odessa. I didn't say that. I don't want anybody to think that that was something I said. So I was really fascinated by this particular novel, and the reason for that has to do with colonialism. I just wanted to make sure that was clear, because I think a lot of people in the U.S., a lot of people in the West don't, understand what that means when you say, Russian colonialism and why people in Odessa speak Russian and not Ukrainian traditionally. Many of you might recognize the church built on the place where Alexander II was assassinated. So we already have sort of a bit of, Odessan irony in that sort of situation. Why Odessans traditionally spoke Russian and not Ukrainian, even though it was always part of Ukrainian territory. And if you read something like Darashevitch's The Odessan Language, you can see a lot of Ukrainianisms in the kind of version of Odessan Russia. I would call it Odessan. I would call it its own language. But I think of dialects as languages. Anyways, this is, we passed the Tsarist period, obviously, in 1917, of course, everybody knows that. And that's supposed to neutralize the MSUKAs, for instance, which I didn't mention, but the MSUKAs prohibited printing anything in Ukrainian. So again, that was the Tsar who did that. That was supposed to have ended with, with the revolutions of 1917. This is Lev Yurkevich, who was a Ukrainian Marxist, who argued with Lenin about language, about specifically Ukrainian, and wanting to make the what would you call it, like the whole Bolshevik package multilingual. Lenin wanted it to be Russian. That was considered the more cosmopolitan language, the language of the urban proletariat. Yurkevich said, you need to use Ukrainian at least to mobilize peasants in villages. And this was a major criticism he had of Lenin. The Ukrainian historian Hanna Perekhoda has written a lot about that. That's him on a horse. But whatever the case may be, we get to the 1920s after the revolution, and for some reason the video is not showing up, but arguably, and again, I'm not the one necessarily for saying this, but arguably this was a time, this was a time of cultural freedom in the Soviet Union, in Soviet Ukraine. This is a time when, for instance, Isaac Babel was writing his stories. And some of the evidence to back that up is what some of you might recognize as Tsigavertov's Человеческий аппаратом, which was filmed in Odessa, the studio he was working at in Moscow, and was kind of glad to go to Odessa, where he did find more freedom than he did in the center of the empire, you could say. Zemlya is a film by one of the trilogy of films by Alexander Dovzhenko, who was also working at Vuvku and who was friends with the artistic editor of Vuvku at that time, who was our hero, Yurii Yanovsky. So this is Yurii Yanovsky. I'm not sure how old he was in this picture, but this is from Майстер корабля, and this is also written when he was like 25. It's strangely a novel written in disguise as a memoir written in the 1970s, looking back on this period in time. So he's talking about being an old man and what fun he had in this place that he never calls Odessa, but only calls Misto, in Ukrainian city. But it's clearly Odessa. There's lots of evidence of that in the text. The people have trouble pronouncing the "ui" in the 1970s. So Yurii Yanovsky is writing he published this novel in 1928, but pretending that he's in the 1970s, looking back on the period that he just wrote about. And by the way, he had gone to Kharkiv after working as artistic editor. So let's talk about this novel. The idea of the master shot to the medium shot, and then obviously this close-up shot. One could say another way of thinking of this in film terms is these are objective shots. Like these don't necessarily have to come through the perspective of a particular person, whereas this is becoming more subjective. There's this kind of idea that the distance from the camera of the object that the camera is focusing on, its distance is kind of a psychic distance with a character. And Yanovsky himself, Yanovsky tries to bring this into literary style. Sorry, this is like so close to the margin, or there really isn't a margin. I'm not going to read this, but you can see here how there's a kind of I guess you could say panning in, there's a zooming in. So in the novel, in language, the novel goes in and out of past tense and present tense. You can describe this just as like what's called in English, I think, the historical present. Sometimes like you want to tell a story to somebody. It's clear that the story happened a few days ago, but all of a sudden you say, I'm walking down the street and I see this cat and the cat jumps up on the platform. Something like that. You move into the present in order to give an idea of proximity, like you're in the story, in the scene. I think that's what Yanovsky's doing as well. So I'm really being careful with that when I translate the tense, but it's quite jarring sometimes. It goes sentence to sentence. But here you have this kind of distant perspective of this couple, Tayach, who's based on the Soviet actress Ita Penzo, and then the narrator going through the streets of Misto during a storm. That's in past tense, but then they come to the hotel where they're both staying, and it switches into present tense and becomes more becomes closer, and then it gets even closer. This is when they've gone into the room, and even though this is still, in present tense, it's kind of getting more into the character's head. This is something different at this point. So this is an example of how the perspective, I think the Jeanette term is like the narrative present. The time in which the story is being written. This is that in the 70s. So this is supposedly aged narrator looking back. But then he'll kind of break into his own speech, like in this parenthesis here. So this is him giving a speech in the 20s. He's at the studio giving a speech to some of the people there about artistic creation. He's the artistic editor, but then he's giving comment on his words then. So it's like a voiceover that kind of injects itself into the film. Somebody was talking about the Barbie movie recently. I think Helen Mirren's voiceover at some points just comes right into the film and sort of injects itself. And this is just to show the way the kind of baseline narration of the novel goes. Also, obviously, the idea of the revolution. And this part at the end is this idea that it doesn't really matter who's writing this. It's just like a camera. I am a camera. I'm just happening on these things. There's the idea of it's not in this section, but endless newsreels and this just this kind of democratization of perspective. I don't know if that's the right phrase for it, but this idea of randomness and how important that is to what's being presented. So I just wanted to give this idea that at this time, these early these avant-garde artists were really creating this republic, and there was this relative period of cultural freedom. As you could see, that was Malevich's Black Square. Malevich wrote about a lot of his concepts in Nova Generacija, in the journal, at the same time refusing to give these same essays to Современная архитектура in Moscow. So he's making a conscious choice to present to a Ukrainian audience, a Ukrainophone audience. His essays were translated. And then I talk a bit about Babel, but I'm not going to do that now. And then this is Krzyzewski's original cover for Maistr Korabля. All right. So I'll read a bit of it. There is mention of Semenko. He's known as just Mikhail in the novel. So somebody says to the narrator, "So you're the editor. Go sit down and write yourself a constitution and bring it here. We'll chat about it." Mikhail doesn't want anything right now, I heard from the studio chief. Mikhail is my former mentor and generally considered the leader of our nation's leftist poets. A futurist, he came up only one little detail short of being a giant. I loved him, if my relationship with him interests anybody. He came to the studio every day, smoked his inevitable pipe, went to look at the sea, and disappeared, leaving only the smell from the capstan of that pipe. I always felt some kind of pulsive flame within him. He was the most romantic of the romantics, yet he hid that with his humor, a little game of the eyes he did while executing funny and uncompromising projects in a shrewd and gloomy manner, as if scolding his woman for an overcooked meal. I already said that he came up only one little detail short of being a genius, but all the same he came up short. For me, his presence at the studio was a lively energy, inoffensive, untroublesome, Next to you, there's somebody who's whistling, solving global problems. And behind him, without tearing yourself away, you can work and work. Soon thereafter, he went on vacation and never returned to the studio, leaving me alone to handle all the directors' groups. I went to write a constitution and did so within a week. So you can also see this idea of like building a state, building a country. That's the basic frame. But then in chapter 6, which I think is the heart of Maik Iohansen, these filmmakers find a sailor washed up on the shore during a storm. And then this sailor kind of becomes the inspiration for Sev, the character who's based on Dovzhenko's film. I'll read from that part. The storm, like an enraged orchestra, deluged us with newer and newer symphonies, each one increasing both in tempo and timbre. In such weather, even if a high-sailed schooner happened to be out there, nobody would see its sails. Only the masts would bend, the sheets whip. The crew, having tied themselves to their berths, would confuse the ceiling with the floor. One wave carried something. Through the fog, we caught a glimpse of a mast or some kind of beam that looked like one. On one end, it looked as if somebody had thrown a pile of wet clothing onto the object, a sleeve visible on the mast. From that sleeve, a hand poking out. The head of a person was pressed against the wood, water running through long hair. The front end of the mast rose above the water like a giant's hand outstretched from the depths of the sea. Sev dashed into the water and, without knowing how to swim, waded in up to his waist and waited for the mast to come closer. I hesitated, knowing the water was cold, but the mast, having washed ashore, started to bang against the rocks, shook off its clinging passenger, and struck Sev twice in the legs. It could easily break his bones. I too plunged into the water, kicking off my shoes and pants. The specimen of a person whom the sea had spewed forth was remarkably alive. We shook and slapped him, dragged him through the sand and sat him on the ground, rubbed and rocked him, and took the sand and grass from his mouth until he finally came to. His thoughts were far, far away. He spoke a few words of what could have been Romanian, then lost consciousness again. We started to wrap him in our jackets. He opened his muddied eyes, and we were shocked at how blue they were. With all our effort, we couldn't get anything out of him that would give us a clue as to who he was, this drifter from the sea. The English phrase, "Water, for God's sake, water," confused us. Was he a Romanian or an Englishman? We sent Tayach for some liquor. "Where am I?" the stranger asked in German, rising up onto his elbow. He became fiercely sick, and we didn't stop him from purging all of it. Then we carried him to a quiet place and took off his clothes. He was a beautiful specimen of a man. His face was weathered and masculine. His body delighted the eyes with its trim lines. We wrung his clothes so that not a drop of water was left in them. Then we prepared to daub the stranger with the vodka Tayach had brought. Finally, we let our patient drink straight from the bottle itself. The vital efforts of our 6 hands and the urgent task which Tayach had done in retrieving the vodka, which was now in the stranger's mouth and stomach, did the job. He finally woke up. Then he became embarrassed, being naked before us. Tayach's eyes blazed. She couldn't tear them away from the sight of the body of this man who must have been a sailor, judging from the anchor we found on his arm. "An excellent opening scene to a future film," said Sev, handing the stranger his clothes. The stranger got dressed, and I noticed how Tayach's eyes gradually became disappointed when the filthy sailor's clothing covered the gorgeous form of the man. Now before us stood a pale sailor, dark-haired and swarthy, with blue misty eyes, terrifyingly exhausted by his journey on the mast. A dark stubble showed through on his cheeks. His face was pleasant, although also unseemly. His gaze, always aimed at the face of his interlocutor, was striking. "A good opening scene," I said lightly, slapping the sailor on his back. "Bist du Deutsch, Mensch?" The sailor gaped at all of us with such a jubilant gaze, as if we had just given him a hetman's regalia at the foot of an illumined ramp. He sat on the ground out of fatigue and reached toward us like a madman. Then he began to kiss the ground and perform other rituals, the way travelers who have returned to their native land do. "My countrymen," we finally heard his nationality. Then the sailor shook unexpectedly and drank the remainder of the vodka from the bottle. For the first time, he looked at us with a frightened glance. "Will I be shot today?" he asked, and immediately swooned again at everything that had happened. Soon after, his swoon turned into a quiet, deep sleep. I'm Bohdan, he murmured when we lifted him up. And so I'm going to leave it there. Thank you. And I guess that's what it means.
Probably. Oh, okay. Hi everyone. Probably I'll meet Mike because I don't talk loud enough. So I'll be reading my latest poems in translations by Kevin Platt, Asher Maria, Timmy Straw, and Ryan Hardy from 2023 to 2025 in descending order. And the poems are, these poems is a part of my future manuscript in English, and probably it will be called Stretches Through a Foot Tunnel, Swarming with Archipelagos of Chatter. This person is in edges of reverberation, symbols, shimmering excite resonance, sound snips, the ribbon of gesture. The noise rendered meme flutters as Taman's base rustles in the cellophane of held breath. A run ripens in motion, in clusters of grapes, seeds of the runners and speeds wanes. The sprint insides itself and the whole's potential spilling over with gesture, skimming along the paper binding of the sea. Vases transport space within partitions of sequencing. Between hand and tree, these shadows sway, bound in by the walls of the vessel, absorbing the interval stream to the bursting point. An agitated relief contracts and expands, resistance band of substance. The gestures cast seals the surrounds with the clenching of fragments. A ripe papaya bursts, dispersal into points, singularities of shifting events, divisible by the glance, weight. Drop shadows from strands interweave as flashes in the crystalline grid of light. Enriched rapture locked in capsules of flickering. A crater voice extends on the soprano chase launch. Paper mache glues together layers of a singer, multiply reproduced in clay. Registers of sculptures compress and release in timber. Squashed dahlias of indistinction, edged by injected affects, barely noticed. The barrier of the deep, pierced by unbroken gallop, marsh hooves, makes concrete hardening in motion like columns of disorder. The clatter overturns a house, a die. Rooms burned through by drums of light alter the relief. The horse taps over the box flap. A match runs off, strikes around the corner. A flash rolls up the water, ring-like rooms of ice contracting in billiard ball, Dogs matrix, spinning out in bean pods. A smile defined by equation takes in the surrounds. Palette of inlaid landscapes. A mesh bag extracts unseen objects from the depth of noise. A lake tooth draws out the diver with a bound breath thread. A boat's wedge cans over bores down ripples, tracing the basin's relief. By inertia, the rain torches the base of the surrounds, a syncopation of light. A bold brush, fences with peripheral vision, wipes away the blind spot. Towers of blank space advance from the eye, fix the minus of landscape in place. And underground river grabs up flat stones of stillness into the funnel of a mole's side. The core deflates under a rush of shrews, spluttering threads corrosive dye. A crater map filled in by blank forms of wounds in red and orange limits. Pinched off light, development of details under the projector's cone. A voiceover unseams the race of the process via Pacman mechanism. Pauses take rest on the benches of a tongue primed to run into impossible walls of communication. Osteoderms of intonations, the object is protected from overheating and overcooling. Mountains cut their smooth stone teeth, signalscaping of a wasteland's surface. Laughed out pores of sun-bleached hairs on the earth's tanned body. A squeak scrapes the rustle of inertia. Perlmutter resounds in Wi-Fi, pouring through ray beam of stained glass. Mantles cutouts work out gold pockets of mountains, convergent sutures in furrows, sea fascia. The pearl capsule embraces the foreigner, expelling. Onto a reel of ice, the tongue winds an archive of pigment. Film petals blossom like a pupil. The data sense immersiveness, rescanning a bit till below the eyelid flesh, eye molecules split by cell division, push buttons of finite things. And the last one. Wizje's Sun Out by Cricket. Mine Dynasty, a camera obscura in the cricket's splintered eyes. The city of a vase courses through the artisan Adam's apple to give leaf in the bloodstream, the body's Bonnie China. Thank you.
I had a question for Ekaterina. I'm very interested in your languaging practices, as in the way that you use language uniquely to you. Because I'm sure as a Ukrainian writer, people put labels and put their own political and ideological labels on your writing and your languaging practice. And so what has been your journey from the past to now, and how do you think in the future your languaging practice will look like?
Thank you for the question. I consider myself as an individual who is interested in radical poetic practices, so I would like to avoid any social, any related to national and social poetics, and I don't like many anti-war poems, even though I think it's important to write that kind of work. But I don't think it could be beneficial for the future of the culture, and that it can help to develop experimental poetry or poetry overall. So I can see myself switching into English to because lately I've been in a dialogue with many American experimental poets, so I can see myself in this context because I am already almost there, but I write in Russian, so it's the only problem I'm having. Thank you.
My question is, I think, mostly for Eugene and Ian, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I couldn't help thinking of this connection of these both of these experimental authors, one poet, the other prose writer, who look into the future where, in a sense, they are literally propelled with this aviation motive or with the ship motive, but in prose, I guess it works kind of narratively different. So he is in the future looking back at the past, while Semenko is kind of being flown into the future, right? Especially in this minimalist kind of experimental language. Is there any connection between them? Is there anything larger that kind of serves as this platform for such foresights, for such futuristic techniques?
You know, for that whole generation lived, you know, people born in the 90s, in the 1890s, not just in Ukraine, not just in the Russian Empire, but in all of Europe, right? Were born with, or became teenagers with a sense of expectation, right? Because it's a generation that there's that famous sentence by Walter Benjamin, by Benjamin, about the World War I generation, that this is the generation that you know, went to school on a peasant's cart, right, and found itself on a killing field, you know, which using the latest industrial technology. So you really had that all over. I think it was different for men and for women. I think in lots of ways, and again, when I talk about futurism, I really talk, you know, 12 to 14. I think basically when those people, a lot of the people got drafted, they began seeing the world a bit differently. But before the war, into which they weirdly enough went gladly and with enthusiasm, most of them, enthusiasm that they later were embarrassed of or wished to disguise, in the case of the Russian futurists, for example. I think it was a really good time to be young. And it was a particularly good time to be a young man.
You know, the pilot, the aeronautics, just flying kind of metaphor. In Maistr korabля, Maik at one point is going into his father's, he's like in his father's kind of cabin, and he's reading the novel that we've all been reading up to this point, and kind of giving commentary about it. And then he says, you know, we pilots are singing this song, and it's this song about the chorus goes, Kapitan, you know, it's about like being a captain, and then that has a layer that it comes back from Bogdan and from these sort of seafaring adventure tales. So Yanovsky is definitely trying to bring the two, kind of the future and the past, and the future being, you know, flight, and the past being maritime travel, putting them together at this point in history. And one thing that stood out to me from the very beginning is how the novel is one of those novels that you know, and even in Ukrainian I could feel this being not a native speaker. it doesn't sound like it was written when it was. At one point he even says, you know, and again, this is the 1970s supposedly. He says the War of the 40s, you know, so much happened in the War of the 40s. That's when his friend Sev died in the War of the 40s. You know, he's writing this while Dovzhenko is still alive, and it's 1928, or probably even earlier because it was published in 28. So it's very weird how he kind of got that one right. Yeah, I feel like there's, and he's always saying, you know, I'm writing to the youth. I'm not writing to people of my generation. So it's, and there's just an irony that he's like 25 years old and he's acting like he's, you know, he's a grandfather, and he's play acting in his narration. I mean, it's fantastic. The irony of it is really fun to translate.
Fantastic to see Ukrainian modernism finally getting translated and getting some traction, but like so much time has been almost like, you know, wasted that cannot be recouped, because obviously the Russian modernism is very well known, and these texts only now getting to hopefully English language public. Do you see, like, what place do you see for them? What their role might be, and like what are you hoping to get with these translations?
As you can see, like a lot of my slides were to show how significant this was in how significant this period was in Ukrainian history, in Eastern European history, and how much that's been repressed, covered up, and so my hope, this is like, you know, this isn't cohesive enough to be some kind of academic presentation. It's more like a marketing package and giving a context for this novel. I mean, I was so surprised. That's why I've been so public about this translation, because I'm still so surprised that it has not been translated, except for Yurii Yanovsky in Australia has translated like this chapter that I read from chapter 6. So, and only a part of that. That's all I've been able to find in English. And so, I mean, I want to give an idea of, I think, what could have been. And maybe at some point there was an idea that people who are like maybe on the left in the West could maybe understand Ukraine better. At this point, I'm not sure how important that is. You know, right? Yeah. Right. So, I mean, but that was the hope at some point last year.
I mean, for me, because I've been working on futurism academically, and because I've been working on international ties in futurism and the avant-garde in general, it's interesting to have Kiev be part of that conversation. And for example, I've been looking at newspapers of that period, and it's interesting that, you know, the kind of international coverage they carry, it's the same kind of press stuff. As far as poetry is concerned, I mean, I know I've been reading Semenko today, but poetry, I find Iohansen much more interesting. Because I think his sound play, I mean, Iohansen he's a modernist, right? He's a pretty kind of I don't know, a very modernist, right? There's not a lot of deviation into, he's very serious about poetry, right? I mean, there's this very kind of artisanal approach to language. And in a way, I mentioned Parshikov, and I don't remember Parshikov ever talking about Iohansen, but when I look at Iohansen, when I make sense of it, there's definitely a structural, very heavy similarity in the way that they treat sound repetition, in a kind of heaviness of the line and the sound structure, in the interest in the Baroque, this kind of shared interest in the Baroque. I would like to do more of that if I ever have time.
Maybe a little bit weird question. If we're talking about Yanovsky as a person of that time, what of his work you consider to be the most impactful? Майстер корабля, or it's more like a Hollywood на березі Чорного моря? What do you think?
I haven't fully read all the essays, but obviously I did read that one essay and many others. I think they're different, but they're also similar.
Yeah.
There are these like scenes where he's just almost like doing what he's saying, like he's just a camera and we're just seeing like what it's like making these films. And I like though what Yasha was asking about, how Maistre Korabля is, that's this framework for it, is Odessa Vuvku, but that it's talking about like this sort of nation building idea. It's talking about this center point between these maritime narratives, adventure sort of narratives, and then the future with pilots, etc. The artistic things that he's doing, I think, in Maistre Korabля are more impactful and I think more interesting. And it can only do that as a novel because it's this fictional 1970s. Hollywood na березі Чорного моря is it's more like creative nonfiction, and it's hilarious, and he definitely gets, I think, the Odessan kind of sense of humor there more because he's openly saying this is Odessa, whereas I feel like he's trying to avoid Odessa's reputation in Maistre Korabля. He doesn't want it to interfere with what he's doing artistically. Question for you, Eugene. So the Солнце Кров, it's like, it reminded me of Ceylon, and I just wondered if you could talk about, like, is there any connection that you see there? This would be before Ceylon.
It's definitely before. So Semenko, right until early 1914, late 1913, was a student in Petersburg, right? Mm-hmm. And we know he was really interested in Guro, who died in 1913, because poems of that period, very often, there's a whole bunch of them that have epigraphs from Guro, or he refers to Igor Severyanin in other poems. So basically, he's obviously interested on the Petersburg take on futurism, which does involve these kinds of compounds, right? So, or maybe not necessarily these kinds of compounds, but what Kamensky called, and that's Kamensky's term, and that he started using in 1910 when he was at Petersburg, kind of avant-gardist, Slovotvorчество, right? So my feeling is that there's some connection to that, but there could easily be another Ukrainian context that I'm simply not aware of. Petersburg futurists, like the ego futurists, right? So the big ego futurist, the most experimental one in 1913 is Vasilis Gnidov, who is Ukrainian, who actually writes the first Ukrainian futurist poem, okay? So, I mean, it's a poem, about half of it is in Ukrainian. And it's published, I think, in the spring of 1913. Did they know each other? I have no idea. Could Semenko have not known of him? I think that would be surprising if he didn't know him. But I don't think that Gnidov or Gnedov is mentioned in the poems, where Severyanin and Guro everywhere. So
That passage from chapter 6, where Bogdan the sailor first starts speaking in Romanian, and then English, and then German, and then finally in Ukrainian.
Yeah.
Right? So was this just taken as a representation of this dream of internationalism for Ukraine?
I think that's a possible interpretation of it. I would agree with that interpretation. He'll use a lot of he'll say things in German sometimes. He'll put German phrases in, and there's a footnote with the Ukrainian translation, or in Latin. Maybe not as much English, but yeah, definitely an international perspective. Which I really enjoy, because it just goes so much against this idea of that Ukrainian can only be, this thing that the Nova Generacija people are kind of against, and Yanovsky kind of resented that too. But he also brings that in. He's not afraid of that. There's a picture of a guy in the Vyshyvanka, and he still brings that in to the novel. Again, I like that he's overlapping these things,